Good evening, Planning Policy. Testing. It's nice to see all of you. I hope everyone had a great June. Staff was kind enough to take us on a tour, and we'll get to hear about that a little bit later this evening. But tonight, we'll get through some boilerplate stuff, and we'll get into our agenda. Tonight's meeting is a hybrid meeting. The Planning Policy Commission is in person, but staff or members of the public may be attending virtually or in person. And to make sure this is official, I did skip over something. I'd like to call the Planning Policy Commission to order. It is currently 6:32 p.m., July 13th. Stephen, do we have a quorum this evening?
I'll respond. Yes, we do have a quorum. It should be noted that Commissioners Esmoede and Milligan both have excused absences.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Our first item of business is to take action to approve the minutes for the May 11th and the 23rd meeting of PPC. Are there any corrections to the draft minutes provided in the agenda packet for May 11th? Vice Chair Bader.
I had an excused absence and not marked as such on the May 11th.
Good catch. All right, duly noted. Are there any other concerns? All right, moving along. The May 23rd agenda minutes. Any concerns, clarifications? Hearing none, those minutes are also approved. Our next item of business is public comments. Stephen, has anyone signed up virtually to make any comments this evening?
No one has signed up to make comments this evening.
It's been a while. Haven't been here since early May. Thank you, Jared. We will skip all of that because there is no one in-house with us this evening. Getting right into it, regular business. And the first item tonight is under regular business is land use overview for the comprehensive plan. Kristen Leeson, our senior planner, will be presenting this tonight. So Kristen, when you are ready, please.
There we go. Hi, good evening. I'm Kristen Leeson, Senior Planner with Community Planning and Development. And yes, we're talking about because we're starting our 2024 periodic update, we're just sort of doing an overview of several of the elements out there. And tonight we're going to talk about land use. Not diving deep in, it's a pretty high level, but just to kind of let you know what we're going to be looking at in this round. So yeah, we're going to look at existing at kind of what's there, what's required by the state, what's newly required by the state, and potential amendments that are being proposed by the staff. So, excuse me, we'll come back to these later. But just at first glance, do you believe the vision captures the intent of the land use element? Do you agree with our proposed amendments? Are there other specific topics that you all would like to discuss with this update? And is there information or feedback that would be helpful in this process? So just think about that as we're going. So the intent of the land use element is to guide the accommodation of growth and change while ensuring the retention of quality of life, environment, character, distinct neighborhoods, and amenities. The land use patterns that are established through the element determine our unique character, types and locations of development and redevelopment, traffic patterns, and they are the vision for the regulations. They set the vision for the regulations that implement our vision. You know what I mean. The vision is long, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I sort of highlighted the bigger aspects of it. Maintains the equity of life, sets the framework for sustainable community, fundamental value and identity of the forested character. It requires stronger protection of the forested hillsides, talks about the public realm, which is making you feel like you're not surrounded by huge giant buildings, but that you're comfortable in this setting, that it's a human scale, and that it's all connected through trails and shared use routes and other connections. Now, so I said that was going to be one of your questions, but it's really not. We're going to talk about it at a later date. And there are a few reasons for this. One is that you may have noticed when I went through the intent of the land use element and the vision of the land use element, they don't really connect. There's not a huge connection there. And the vision talks a lot about environment and trees and so forth. Well, the state now requires us to have a separate element for environment and resilience and climate change and resilience. So Stephen has been working with the environmental board to talk about what policies would come out of the land use element to help form this new chapter required by the state. And so I think what we'll do is start thinking about what the land use element should be, okay? And we'll go back to the vision later once we've started talking about the policies and making sure that everything is cohesive, it's all there, that what we see as what the land use element needs to be is actually in there in the policies. And then we go back and do, or, you know, I generally would go back and do the vision last for like my introduction to my story, but I just needs to be looked at later. So don't get wrapped around the axle on that one yet, okay? I think we need to break it down more before we can talk about it. Okay, so that was a really long thing to say we're not going to talk about it. All right. Current state requirements are that, one, we have a land use map, and the land use map has to show the city limits, which is in black here, the urban growth area boundary, which is the line that you see in red, and you can see that most of our city, about 2/3 of our city, border the urban growth boundary, and the proposed distribution and location of land uses, which are the land use designations that you see there. So mixed use, retail, we have community facilities, conservancy, so that's, we have that. They require that we show population estimates. Now you can't read this, and you don't need to read this right now, but it shows what our population is at a certain date, and then we project it out for the next 20 years, which is our planning horizon. Okay? It requires that we show population densities. So in our memo, I said we cover this, and then going back and looking at it a little bit more closely, we don't quite. So we do population, we show our acres. This is from our buildable lands report that was done in 2019. We show how much acreage is available for development and redevelopment, and we show what capacity we have for housing units and for jobs. And that's a 2-year process that we work through with the state. But we don't have our building intensity, which is also required. So these samples are from Everett. They're kind of small. I didn't realize how small. These are from Everett and Kirkland. And they pretty much take the table that I just showed you, and they put in there in the middle, based on their zoning, the densities that are allowed within those land uses. So Everett, right here, they'll show in this range, you can go from, you know, say 1 dwelling unit per 5 acres to 4.5 dwelling units per acre with a max height of 35 feet or something like that. Kirkland's a little bit more detailed, and they come down and they have their zones that fall within that land use designation. They have their zones on the right-hand side and list specifically what each zone allows. So we'll look at that and we'll change our table so that it looks something like this. And we will insert all that there. And you guys can tell me which way you prefer. Okay? And I'm going to have to work through it first. And they require that we provide protection for the quality and quantity of groundwater used for our public water supplies. And we do have policies in our plan right now that address these. When we go through it, again, if you want to enhance these, shorten these, edit these, we are more than welcome to do that. But we do have the policies there. We're covered. And water discharge. We have to provide guidance for corrective actions to mitigate or cleanse state water discharges that pollute waters of the state. So Lake Sammamish has streams that would then eventually, it's a state lake, right? And then it has streams that eventually go into the sound as well. So we have that. And we do have policies, 5 different policies that address that in our plan right now. I didn't list them all, but there's a link to the site. You can go through that. All right, new state requirements since 2020. Most of these are since 2021. But one, this is a biggie, that we include policies to reduce risk from wildfires, or reduce and mitigate the risk to lives and property posed by wildfires. And as you know, we have a lot of forested lands around here and a lot of homes that are close to those forested lands. So I've reached out to our emergency management director to see if he has any policies that he's aware of. But that one's going to be a big one for us to cover in the land use chapter. Physical activity, we do have a lot of policies that cover this. Most of them, however, are in our transportation section and in our park section, but the state requires that we include it in our land use section as well. So some things that I was thinking about that might include this would be safety. Just making sure that, you know, sidewalks are well lit, or that they're wide enough, that we cover ADA, that kind of thing. That our trails and sidewalks are connected, that we promote active street levels, meaning, like I said, that you don't have giant buildings, that you have windows that are, you know, clear, and that you feel safe walking on those streets, not like you're walking against a brick wall. Generally, you have smaller block sizes, which also help with that. Require pedestrian scale development, which would be part of that, or treat wide right-of-ways as places. So it's not just a street. Don't think of it just as a street that sends people through, but places where people can stop and congregate. Things to think about. Population projections, we do include these, and it says make sure that your population projections are consistent all the way through. We do that. We have our buildable lands and we have our population projections, and we try to make sure that when we look at safer, but double check us. When we do capital facilities or utilities, you talk about populations and future populations a lot so that we can plan for it. So we just need to make sure that that is done. Staff proposed updates. Not enough to do. Remove community facilities, land use designations, and create a new designation. So right now, we have land use designations, which are the umbrella, I talked about this before, the umbrellas right here, that contain within them all the community facilities zones, which are open space, recreation, and facilities. The differences between these two is the one that has CFOSPO, anything with PO after it, those are all up in the Issaquah Highlands, and that means that they are privately owned. Yeah, it was done later. But what we're finding, particularly with the community facilities, so they all allow, normally within land use designations, one big umbrella has low density residential. So you'll have anything that can have housing from one, dwelling unit per 5 acres up to 4.5 dwelling units per acre. And that's it. So it's all generally housing that can go under there. But when you look at the community facilities, you've got anything from open space where you can't have paved areas, can't be impervious, to buildings that can be built within that same umbrella. And it's making it hard whenever any entity wants to come in. We have to do a whole comprehensive plan amendment just to change it from, you're a building that, the PSC came in and bought a building and we have to rezone it. You have to do a whole comprehensive plan amendment. It shouldn't be that difficult. So that's our basic reason for wanting to change it. It just doesn't make a lot of sense the way it's set up. So what we're proposing, this is my scribble, is that we get rid of the Conservancy, or this is just an initial thing that came out of my head, okay? So that we would get rid of the Conservancy, community facilities, and community facilities privately owned land use designations. And what I have found is that most cities, bless you, most cities will just they'll just have a land use designation that's called park and open space. And within those, we would just take everything that's in Conservancy, TP and RCA, Conservancy recreation, the open space, the recreation, CFR, CFOS, and put all those under park and open space. And then potentially, and again, it's just out of my head, move the CFF and CFFPO down to like mixed use, where it allows for those buildings and more commercial uses that are allowed under CFF. Needs to be reviewed, initial thought, but something for you guys to chew on for a while. Did you guys have any questions so far? I've just been talking.
Commissioner Krass?
So this seems like this is like hygiene, which is great. Kind of be clear. When you have the amendments, these are not what the state, these are just city of Issaquah wants to do extra things. There's no requirement by the state for these. And they also don't conflict as we go through them with anything of the state. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And I actually, with this one, I actually have been to the Municipal Resources, MRSC, Municipal Resources Service Organization or something like that. And they have lawyers and staff planners on hand to help you address questions. So I emailed him and I said, how do other cities do this? And so he and I have been going back and forth on the phone. So just to make sure to address, to answer your question, yeah, it shouldn't conflict. And it's one that's being asked for by staff and not by the state. We desperately need to update our sub-area map. So we've had this sub-area map in place for a very long time, well, since 2014, 2013. But in the meantime, a neighborhoods map was also developed. I don't know if it was ever officially adopted, but it was developed, and people are, one's called a neighborhoods map, one's a sub-area map. We'd like to change the sub-area name to neighborhood. It's just friendlier. And these are really neighborhoods. That's what we need to identify. But the boundaries in these two don't match. We need to rectify that and merge the maps together. We use them both as planners, but residents also. Jason.
Go ahead, Commissioner Kraft.
One more question. So there'll be just one, not a superset, subset of, because when I read through some of the other things, I saw sub areas which seemed bigger than I saw the term neighborhoods, which I think of smaller. Those are really going to be the same thing.
They are.
Okay.
Yes.
Got it. That's
And part of this is because the city strategic plan has asked us to preserve the character of neighborhoods. And what we've fallen on is that means doing neighborhood plans and working with neighborhoods to see what characteristics they actually they identify with in their neighborhoods. So in order to do those neighborhood plans, we need to know what the neighborhood boundaries are. And we need to come up with policies and a common thread that goes through all of these plans. So the plans will foster awareness for the neighborhoods on what their interests really are, and it'll maximize all the public input from the residents. Hopefully it'll be, hey, we're talking about your neighborhood tonight. Come and meet with us, instead of people just coming to the city and saying, driving me crazy, we don't have sidewalks on this side of the street. This way everybody comes together as one. So hopefully a bigger voice. And then the policies that would go into the comprehensive plan will establish, like I said, a common framework or a common thread that would go through all of these, identify core needs, and then identify techniques and tools to help address the issues in the neighborhood, such as we used to have a neighborhood grant program where I worked a long time ago, and things like that. This one we're not going to do now. We were going to add policies regarding form-based code for Central Issaquah. One is that we actually already we realized we have a policy in there that says use form-based code as one of the tools. So it's already in there, but this also talks specifically about Central Issaquah, and maybe we want to use it in some other way. So we're going to put a pause on that whole topic for now and wait until the comprehensive plan is done and we start talking about housing again and we update the Central Issaquah plan again. So that'll come later. It's not going away. It's just a topic that we've just decided to postpone. And lastly, relocate environmental policies. So effective July 23rd, like I said, the state is now going to require, when I sent out the memo, it wasn't required yet, but now they've adopted it and will be required to have a climate change and resiliency element. And so, as I said, Stephen's been working with the environmental board to figure out what's going to be in that element and not in the land use element anymore. So that will change. So, question one. That's all I have for the changes. Do you agree with our proposed amendments? Is anything?
Great, thank you, Kristen. So yeah, let's open it up for our commissioners to ask questions and feedback. Vice Chair Bader.
To answer the question, yes, I agree with staff's proposed amendments. I have a question that is maybe reading between the lines is maybe somewhere else and has already been addressed, but when we're looking at population growth, it feels like the focus is on housing to accommodate that growth. And so I'm wondering where kind of the rest of the things that are needed to support growth like exist. And so like, are there policies for creating like jobs and economic development? Are there policies for like access to social services that also support that population growth outside of housing?
Yes and no. So there is a policy in the housing element that talks about having a jobs housing balance and keeping that. So we'll look at that more there. I would imagine that economic development would be addressing the jobs as well. And during Title 18, there was an issue about, we don't want to lose jobs. We couldn't put it in the code though, but we may want to find a way to strengthen that in our policies, that we don't want to lose jobs through development of housing, that kind of thing. And yes, it is addressed. So there are utilities plans. And when I said that utilities and capital facilities, it's important that we have our population numbers right. We talk to them all the time when they're updating plans and when they're applying for grants about what our future populations are going to be. So yes, that is always incorporated because they have to figure out the growth too. So it's there. And then we have a human services element as well. And they just did a human services plan. So we're working on policies that would address that as well.
Commissioner Grass?
I'm overspeaking. Interesting stuff. So the only questions I have, when you talk about the neighborhood plans, which sub areas equal neighborhoods, there's a lot of details because this is going to be a fairly hot topic. Because like, who decides what's in the policies, who approves them, subjective things. As I read through, there are things like culture, look and feel, and things like that. How do you add? How do you quantify those type of things? Like a building height you can do, setbacks you can do. When you talk about character or things like that for specific areas, I think the details are going to be really important. Is that so? Will there be a drill down on like how? This one I think is a real. We have to get a microscope out on the neighborhood because everyone in their neighborhood is going to care what their neighborhood is because that's where they live, and how you get to the decisions of what those are important as well. So what is the process of understanding how what the policies, how they get written and kind of more specifics of?
So right now, we're not going to start addressing individual plans. That's going to come after this, and we'll do about 2 a year. What we're going to do in the land use element, or at least the way that I've seen, I've looked at several other comprehensive plans with other cities, who some of them have entire chapters on this. But what they've done is they'll have the different topics that they're going to talk about. So one might be housing, one might be transportation, one might be economic vitality. And it just says, kind of address these things, address character there. I'm sorry, there's some, it just talks about addressing the character there, but what happens is then you go out to the neighborhoods and they say, is there something, maybe a neighborhood doesn't have an HOA and CCNRs that regulate what housing could look for. But they're like, we don't have those regulations. We want our area to stay the way it is. So please let's develop regulations. So as far as housing goes or land use goes, it becomes establish, architectural regulations for this neighborhood, just like we did for Old Town. Or transportation. Some neighborhoods like that they don't have sidewalks everywhere. They're good with it. They like the way that the environment is with that, their character. But some neighborhoods are like, we need sidewalks everywhere. So that's part of your transportation, and some of it's just, it's so broad, I can't get into the detail of each one, but it would be high level topics. And it would say things like update plans every 5 years so that you have regular, discussions with neighborhoods. It would have, here are the tools that are available to neighborhoods. Work with neighborhoods to figure out what you want to do or what they want to do.
Yeah, this could be a book, but I guess who decides is kind of a key thing. Like how, like I live looking at the map. I'm not sure if I'm Old Town or Newport. The line goes right through my house, I think. But when you make a decision for what happens in those, I think the understanding of who gives input and who makes the final decision and how it all works would that be part of the policy document, or would that be?
Once we get to the neighborhood plans, that's part of it. So
Okay.
you go out and you go to the neighborhoods and you have regular meetings with those neighborhoods.
Yeah.
You say, here's what we're going to talk about tonight. And they say, but this is what's important to us. This is what's important to me. And they agree on it. And we start writing policy. And then we have meetings here where you'll show draft documents and people will talk about it. And then eventually it makes it to city council, and people are always writing in comments. It's just like every other public process that we do, where you get everyone involved that you can, and they walk with you through the process up until it ultimately gets adopted by city
So
council.
city council, that is.
Yes.
Okay, 'cause-
But it's all based on what the neighborhoods, what the residents have to say who live in that neighborhood. I'm not going to go to a neighborhood and say, this is what you need.
no, but
Yeah.
there's going to be some conflict in some of them.
Oh, of course
where you-
there will
Where you
be.
have to build density, but some people don't want density because they moved here 30 years ago.
Right.
We all read next door of why they moved here, and that's not the reality of it. So, all right, it's a hard thing, so
Okay, and it's, if you've got neighborhoods that are all zoned single-family suburban, you're not going to go start changing zoning regulations and say, this is allowed here, this isn't allowed here, because you've got, 35% of the area that's zoned single-family resident or single-family suburban. So it's not necessarily zoning changes and height and stuff like that. It's just character. Yeah. It's not quite as in-depth as that.
So I'll just add on, differentiating between the two, we're really talking about what's going to happen within this comprehensive plan and really setting the template of what's going to be going into the neighborhood. Like Kristen said, after this process, then we're going to start diving into each of the individual neighborhood plans to decide what those individual policies should be with the neighborhoods.
So if I could just follow up with that. So the idea is to move from the sub-area plans, move it more towards neighborhoods. And then the idea is, for lack of a better word, when we did the Old Town update, that was very specific. We're talking about basically making the same judgments in neighborhoods, maybe at a higher level, but having that be part of the comprehensive plan, the land use element. Like getting that kind of.
Yeah, and very, very similar to Old Town.
Right,
I mean,
it's
very
just probably a little bit more high level. I mean, some
Right.
of those like Talus, I mean, those, like you said, those are all covenants
Right.
and things like that, but.
So for example, Old Town, one of them was, I can't remember if it was under environment or public realm, but it was, Old Town has, Issaquah Creek runs all the way through it, right? So one of the policies in Old Town is open up public access to Issaquah Creek where possible. So some of them, it runs through a parking lot. And so you work with that property owner to make public access there and make it attractive so that people will go there. So that's a policy specific to Old Town, things like that.
But that is the idea in the future, is that once you guys consolidate it, kind of more set up by neighborhoods versus sub areas, which,
Right.
like you said, they're basically mirror one another for the most
Right.
part. And the idea is to kind of work in, again, maybe a Old Town light for everywhere.
Exactly.
Commissioner Altamore.
Thank you. So sorry, I may be asking something similar because I wasn't here for the Old Town, so I apologize about that. But so within the question that you're asking here, where it says add policies for neighborhood plans, Stephen, you mentioned a template. So would we be talking about sort of the template for the plan and the process to start to develop the plan, and then it would stop? Because after the comp plan amendment is done, then we would move into actually doing, you said 2 a year for the neighborhood plans.
Yes.
So what we'd be saying yes to here is the yes to setting a process and a sort of a guideline of
Yes.
how to do it, but we won't be doing it.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Right, because those would be all set up, like you said, meetings, neighborhood meetings, public hearings, those things. And then eventually making its way up.
Exactly.
Commissioner Kennedy.
I would think a lot of our neighborhoods, like the Highlands, has CCNRs. How many neighborhoods do we have that don't have something like that would need them?
I don't know yet. I mean, we need to find that out. A lot of them have HOAs, but not necessarily CCNRs. We need to adjust it. It'll be similar to that, but we need to adjust it. Yeah.
Commissioner Patterson.
What's the process for getting that approved from a sub-area map to an updated neighborhood map? Is that a city council?
It'll be part of the comprehensive plan process. So we'll talk with you all, and we'll, hopefully people will come and, we'll draw proposed boundaries and
Got
see what people think. It'll just be part of the process.
Are there any other questions for Kristen? I have a couple,
Okay.
but I want to make sure the commissioners get their time into. Two of mine, my favorite topics, traffic. Are we going to have some type of land use element? You guys mentioned traffic, I think. Requirements, including the following. No, apologies. I think it's
Under physical activity?
right. So would we be lucky enough to get something like a traffic overlay when we're looking at something like land use elements to be able to see? I mean, I think of today as a perfect example. where Front Street was invaded by 50-foot monster trailers. And I know they had to do it to divert traffic from 18, but I mean, I'm seeing the traffic times get worse down there. And today, I mean, it was at 2:45, I think it took me 40 minutes to go from Boehm's to Our Savior. That's not even a joke. It's 40 minutes. So it's getting worse. I just wonder, is there something that we'll be able to look at in terms of land use elements when it comes to like a traffic overlay? Or is that not? I would imagine that's feasible, but
It's doable.
like that.
Yeah. And you just want to see what the roads, what
Well,
they're
yeah.
classified as on top of the land use?
Most of Issaquah's environmental policies are contained in the land use element. Therefore, most climate, natural environment policies will be removed from the land use element, relocated to a new element. I'm wondering if traffic could be one of those newer things brought in.
Well, I mean, we have a transportation element,
Okay, so it would just stay there.
but they are related. So,
So it's kind of like, look at this page over here, hot link over there.
yeah, I mean, you think about it, I mean, we know that our, eventually our heaviest traffic will likely be in central Issaquah because that's where all of our housing will be. Hopefully that's where jobs are going to go. And so we've sort of planned for, adding new roads in there. You've got the new Mall Street coming in, and you've got a few other new roads that are supposed to go in to help accommodate the traffic there.
So it is definitely a consideration, even though it's not something, that's something city planners will see, not necessarily boards or.
They've seen it. When we did the Central Issaquah plan, it came through the boards and commissions, and the Transportation Advisory Board sees it as well. When we get there, I mean, when we start going through it, if there's something really specific that you want to, I'm not quite sure what to overlay there, but
Yeah, I know we do the traffic studies and you can see certain spots of the city where there's definitely heavier traffic versus others. I just wondered more or less, is it a consideration when we're talking about land use element codes? And it sounds like you said, there's a transportation advisory board that does look at those things. I just don't know, is that something that also, sounds like it's interconnected.
you know what it is, and we're also doing our environmental impact statement with the comprehensive plan this time, and the environmental impact statement definitely covers transportation and traffic and the impacts of the proposed land uses and areas. So
Oh, I'm getting a
Were you gonna
big
bring that
yes
up
from
too?
Steven.
were you going to bring that up too?
Yeah, no,
Okay. Yeah, the environmental impact statement will cover that.
It's an
Yeah.
issue near and dear to my heart.
I know.
So,
I know.
Okay, number two, real quickly, when it talks about including the following, protecting existing residential development and infrastructure through community wildfire preparedness and fire adaptation measures, does this also include, for one, East Side Fire? Would they be a party to those discussions? And then two, when I think about that, it says education for the public. Are we also talking about controlled burning and things like that, which, like, to your point, we're surrounded by forest. Unfortunately, if these fires do start jumping across the Cascades more and more into Western Washington, our pretty city is vulnerable. So I kind of wonder, like, what extent does that look like?
So this is new to me too, and I'm just becoming familiar with it, which is why I contacted our emergency management guy, and also because Steven said contact the emergency management guy. But yeah, so I would imagine that is definitely on his radar and would wind up in our comprehensive plan and the education and definitely working with EFR or East Side Fire and Rescue. But
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Any other questions for Kristen, commissioners? All right, well, thank you for the presentation, Kristen.
You're welcome. But may I ask one more question?
Of course.
Okay. Two more questions, actually. Are there any topics that you all would like to see in addition, besides traffic, potentially, with this update? And is there any information or feedback that you all need to help make decisions? And you don't have to answer all of that now. You'll probably have more as we go through policies, but.
I don't want to ask you about things that you put a pause on purpose. We said kind of a waste of our time. So when we come back to the form-based code, I'm sure most of us will have more questions, but you said to hit pause.
Yes, we did.
So
We hit
let's
the
not
pause
waste any
button.
time talking about it tonight. So we'll see it when we see it. Commissioner Altamore.
Will you be sending out those slides so that we can read the things that we couldn't read?
Oh,
The charts?
Yeah, the examples from like
Oh,
Everett,
yeah.
Kirkland.
Yeah, I will do that.
Okay, great.
You know what, I'll just send you the presentation.
Oh, perfect.
How about that?
Thank
Okay.
you so much.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Patterson.
Yeah, I understand it's a work in progress, splitting out the environmental elements as well. But there were a couple topics that got brought up tonight, like groundwater protection, I think the wildfire and stream discharge and such. I'm just curious, like, following that topic as we move forward, I'd like to stay on top of what gets pulled out and place in that environmental one compared to what stays.
Stephen, do you want to talk to them about what you all have discussed so far?
So Stephen Padua, Long Range Planning Manager. So I, as Kristen said, I've been working with an environmental board to identify which of the goals and policies that are in the existing land use element to now switch to this new element. And a lot of what we discussed with them and the feedback we received with them is it makes sense to move over a lot of the environmental preservation goals and policies. It makes sense to move over a lot of the policies related to climate change and climate resiliency. And there's currently ongoing work with climate vulnerability assessment going on with that the sustainability staff is working with their environmental board, and goals and policies, new and goals and policies will be introduced through that work into this new element as well. And so as an overall package, that's what we're aiming for. And so we'll keep you in the loop in terms of what gets moved over or what might get changed through that process.
But one of the things that they did talk about keeping in the land use element would be sort of green building issues. And I think the fire protection would be one that would stay in the land use because it has to do with development and how to protect the development and the land. So those would likely stay here.
Commissioner Kennedy, did you have a question or a comment?
Probably a dumb one. I'm assuming at the end of the day, this all comes down to you will be proposing language for all these different changes that you read.
Yes, next time we come back, we will probably have a draft for you all and probably break it up actually into 2 or 3 different parts because there are a lot of policies.
Did you have a question number 2?
No, those was it. So is there any other information that you need?
Okay, well, thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
And now the second item under our regular business is the equity lens for comprehensive plan review. Stephen Padua, our long-range planner, will be presenting that this evening. So, Stephen, when you're ready.
Give me 1 second, I'm gonna move up to the podium. Okay. Hello, everyone. Stephen Padua, Long Range Planning Manager. Tonight, we're going to talk about equity tools to be applying as we're doing a lot of our comprehensive plan policy discussions throughout for the upcoming months. And a lot of this is a follow-up to a lot of our equity discussions we've had in the past. We've had training on unconscious bias. We've had discussion on the importance of recognizing racial equity and applying a certain perspective of how we're doing our policy discussions. And so this is now the next stage of a lot of those discussions. Now applying a tool or a use of tools to kind of broaden our conversations to incorporate racial equity. Expectations for tonight's meeting, or at least this discussion. I'm hoping you all ask a lot of questions because the intent of this discussion is really to help you all understand and apply what an equity lens is and how to incorporate it as part of our policy discussion. And so really tonight's about how to use the process. We'll have some examples that I'll go through, not necessarily to get feedback on the specific examples, but more of how do we use this process for examining the policies themselves. So a little bit of background. The city has established a vision and goal for equity and inclusion as an organization and as a community. We've established an equity team that looks at a lot of different components of internal processes to external relationships and conversations. We've looked at different recruitment processes and try to make improvement to incorporate equity in terms of questions we ask, the type of process we use, or even how we advertise positions for city positions as well as for boards and commissions. We've expanded a lot of our city services, particularly around human services, to recognize some of the inequities or lack of access to certain city services historically. We've incorporated more training for staff and boards, commissions, as you've experienced in recent months, of talking about racial equity and unconscious bias. We've established a new equity board to help the city have some of these conversations of how do we look at certain policies, how do we look at certain processes and address equity in an effective, efficient. And then more recently, the City Council has approved the use of a draft equity framework. And I call it a draft because really the intent of this framework is for us to now start applying a tool to a lot of our work, but it's more piloting the framework as well, because this is something that you won't get perfect right away. It's something you have to work through and adjust so that it works for each of our departments, different projects, each of our divisions, different discussions, and even our commission discussions as we're looking through the comprehensive plan, as a good example. And so the intent of the equity framework is really to put it through incremental application in different ways and in small ways, and then build it up to now building it as common practice with a lot of our work. And so right now we're training staff on how to use this, as well as boards, commissions to use it as part of our discussions. And the intent or the goal for the framework at this point is to continue to improve it so that it can be applied even broader. Before I continue on application equity lens, is there any questions on any of the background? Okay. So this kind of leads us to what we are doing with our discussions. We are hoping to apply an equity lens with our discussions on comprehensive plan policies. And what the equity lens is an examination of how different groups are likely affected by any proposed decision that we might encounter. The goal of this is to be used to eliminate and prevent adverse consequences on many of those different groups in our community. And so we want to look at how to apply it with our policy discussions. And I show this graphic to really show we are really at the initial stages of using this equity lens. It's the idea of an equity lens is it's more of a process. It's not just a couple questions that you saw in your materials. It's asking those questions and going through the process of understanding why you're getting the answers that you're getting. And so at this stage, we're going through the policy formulation. We're applying that lens. The process is that you continue to ask those questions or similar questions through the different life cycle of the policy development. So after we formulate the policy, we then go through the adoption process in discussion with City Council and giving them feedback and applying some of those questions throughout that process and so forth through the policy life cycle. And once we come back to it, ask those same questions. So tonight is really trying to better understand what that process looks like. And it all starts with the equity lens, which is those three questions. What are the racial equity impacts of a particular decision? Who will benefit or be burdened by that particular decision? And then are there strategies to mitigate unintended consequences? The examples that I'm going to go through tonight is to look at particular desired outcomes with the equity lens and how to apply it. And what we're trying to aim to do is eliminate and prevent discrimination and inequities. And we want to establish this equity lens as common practice. And so being that this is an initial step, it's going to feel uncomfortable. It's going to feel foreign to you in terms of, you haven't used this type of tool before. And that's okay. And that's part of the reason why we're asking for you to ask questions on how best to apply this tool, because we want to make sure that with your questions and our responses, we're improving not only the questions themselves, but also the process of using them for the policies. So for the examples that I'm going to go through.
Sorry to interrupt. I just have a quick
please.
question. So the first question specifically specifies racial equity. The others don't. Are we talking about all of the dimensions of equity? So this could be age, economic or socioeconomic, gender identity, sexuality, et cetera, of religion, all of country of origin, et cetera.
It is, and I point out racial equity with this question, and really it should be with all the questions, primarily because what we've learned in the profession and in the trainings of staff is that when you're addressing racial equity in itself, you are actually addressing a lot of the inequities for the other population groups that they're experiencing within the system or foundations that have been kind of built on race. And so when we're addressing racial equity, you are addressing a lot of inequities for the other groups. Are there any questions on that? So I'm going to dive into a couple examples on using the process. The intent of these examples is primarily for us to have a discussion of the process, not to dive into and try to pull out the issues with the policies themselves, but to really better understand the process. And so this is kind of the point where I'm hoping we have a little more discussion of where, at what point, what questions should we be asking, what information should we be looking for, and so forth. Okay. And the process that I'm talking about is when you apply the equity lenses at first. You look at those first three questions. The second is applying what's called a root cause analysis, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of trying to figure out why something is the reason it is. And the last part of that is evaluating the data that's available. And what you'll learn going through this process is you won't always get the data or information you're going to need to answer questions, and that's okay. But it's good to point that out because that's part of the improvement of the entire process. So the first example, I'll let you all read it. So with this example, how do we apply the equity lens? When you're asking the question on what are the racial equity impacts of a particular decision around manufactured homes or in single family neighborhoods, think about what are those impacts? What are the impacts to different community? Who benefits or is burdened by this decision with those type of homes or any those neighborhoods? And then what could be potential strategies to mitigate those unintended consequences? The next step is now applying the root cause analysis and asking the question why. And the suggestion is you ask it multiple times because more often than not, you're going to get to a root cause of what was causing the issue in the first place because you're really not going to typically get the answer right away. And so you want to dig into more of why is this an issue or why isn't it something that we haven't noticed before? And then lastly, you want to evaluate the data. What information do we have that can help answer those questions of why? What can help answer those questions for the equity lens? What information do I need to find to better answer those questions or come up with those mitigation for those unintended consequences? And how can we best provide a lot of that data or find that data or information so that we can come up with a better decision? And you repeat the process. Now, before I start diving into this example, are there any questions about kind of those three steps? Yes.
Commissioner Altamore.
Thank you. I don't know if this is a question as much as just a request that, particularly applying those first three questions, if the key and the core tenets of the implicit bias training were available and very visible, I think that's important. Mm-hmm. When you put something together like a housing type, like manufactured housing or whatever the example might be, the implicit bias is so, the risk is so great of who people assume might take advantage of an opportunity like that and the whys and all of that. So I just think that I would really like for us to pair that together as much as we can, because this is going to be a learning process for all of us so that we are examining our own implicit biases before we move forward into answering those.
Yes, no, I think that's actually a fantastic, because that is one of the important aspects of why we're pushing for a lot of the unconscious bias training for not only staff, but a lot of the boards and commissions when we're having these policy discussions or making recommendations on decisions at the city. Any other questions or suggestions?
Commissioner Krass.
My question is, it'd be interesting, you gave a couple examples here. Is part of your process of going through this is look back at some decisions from Issaquah from the last year, pick a period of time, and then overlay this lens and just be critical of, oh, would we have asked different things now? Just looking at some real examples of some decisions that were made in Issaquah over the last year. And what would we learn from that by overlaying those different questions? And that may shed some light of something at the time, you're like, oh, we didn't even think of that. And those may be some aha moments that will help refine how you actually use this by looking at our own real world examples of people who are.
No, I think that's actually a really great point, and an important aspect of this process of getting a better understanding of why this decision was made in the first place and what information went into that decision-making process, or what discussions were had, who was involved. And that's kind of part of the reason why I provided the entire equity framework as part of your materials for tonight, to let you know, this is such a small piece of the entire pie of how to address equity within our systems. And so I want to be able to provide you the tools, or at least the processes and understanding of the tools, so that you can ask the right questions, or at least ask for the right information so that you can help provide a better recommendation for the city council. Any other questions?
So you can still go.
So with the second example, encourage preservation, rehabilitation, and redevelopment of existing housing stock and support neighborhood-based improvement programs. Think about what goes into this policy. Encourage preservation, rehabilitation, and redevelopment of existing housing stock and support neighborhood-based improvement efforts. Now apply that equity lens, going back to the three questions. What are the racial equity impacts of that particular decision, if that were to be the policy? Who will benefit or be burdened by the decision? And then are there strategies to mitigate? And then going back to applying the root cause analysis, asking why. Why am I getting the answer that I am getting? Why are we getting the desired outcomes or unintended consequences from the decision? And then evaluate the data of what's available to understand why the decision was made, what went into the outcomes that resulted from the decision. Just continue to ask why. Before I move on to the third example, any other questions? So for the third example, promote affordable infill residential construction through flexibility in development technique. Apply the equity lens. Ask those three questions again. Go through the whys and evaluate the available data. And a lot of the reason why I use these particular examples in terms of when I went out to other cities and tried to find policies to have this discussion is you're oftentimes going to be very apparent where there's going to be inequities in the policy. But looking at some of the examples, it's not very apparent oftentimes. And sometimes you won't be apparent until you start digging into the data or asking questions about some of the unintended consequences. What were the outcomes? What happened in other communities when they had a very similar policy? And get a better understanding of how can we mitigate for that? How can we now have a discussion of what do we actually want from the policy, or how can we tweak the policy to get what we want? And it's always going to be a continued process every time we have these policy discussions. We're not going to get it right the first time. We're going to be able to make recommendations and have discussions based on the information we have at this point. And 5-10 years from now, or 1-2 years from now, we might have more information that could help with these decisions. It's just a continued process of going through this or using this tool. So before I go on to next steps, is there any questions on the process itself?
Maybe not questions, but like reflections. And so I want to be transparent that I am coming into like my questions and reflections as identify as a white woman, right? And so that is the lived experience that I bring. I don't have I'm unfortunate enough to not have, right, personally experienced inequities in my life. And so as a commission, I don't want to claim your own identities, but I think we primarily present as white. I think power sharing is a really important piece of this. And I think it's one thing for us as a commission to make assumptions, right, about what racial equity impacts are. I think it's another thing to, ask the questions about where do we actually find out, right? Where do we actually get that information from? And so I don't know if there's a process to kind of help us with that. I really appreciate your kind of calling out like that it's a safe space, right, to ask questions, to, name what we don't know. But then what is the pathway, right, to both like connect with those who do know, right, who have experienced inequities in this city. And so we just want to like know what that path is, right, of like where do we find the answers when it might not be our own experiences, right, because there's something that doesn't feel genuine about making assumptions on behalf of others. I also want to just like say that this is what I do in my day-to-day job. And so I work with health systems specifically to apply an equity lens to their work and also using like improvement methodologies. So the 5 whys are what we talk about a lot. And I almost want to propose like steps 4 and 5, which is that it's not enough to just kind of stop at the like identifying the problem, but we need to act on that, right? And so step 4 is like identify opportunities for improvement. And then, step 5, you said it yourself, right? We're piloting, we're testing. How do we test those, ideas that come out of, not only this commission, but the groups that we're hopefully connecting with, right, as part of this process. And so I don't think it's like enough to just say like, let's analyze, let's, identify, but we need to act on to truly, address inequities.
No, I actually think that's a great suggestion. And the reason why it wasn't included as part of tonight's presentation is really just to help the commission get started, because we are all starting at different place in terms of our understanding of applying an equity lens, our understanding of the inequities that are built into systems. And so I'm trying to get you at least started to ask those questions. And I absolutely agree with you, Sarah. Like, these are great questions to ask, but it's really just the starting point. We really need to better understand how do we act on a lot of these issues. And but the starting point is identifying the issues first and figuring out why we didn't see these issues in the first place. Thank you for that. Any other questions, comments? So the next steps, follow-up meetings to tonight. This really was just the next step from the previous discussions. This isn't the end point. This isn't where we want to stop talking about this. We want to follow up with all of you to figure out how best we can provide you more information, more tools, more discussions on this, and being able to incorporate as part of the comprehensive planning policy discussions, but also other work that we're doing as a commission as well. Yes.
Sorry, I could fill the next long time on this. Really concretely, are these 3 questions going to be like added to our packets from now on? Are those like a lens that we like to be really concrete, right? Like, are we acting on this now, or like what is the implementation kind of timeline as we're like accepting this as like a learning process, right? When do we start, right?
I'm hoping you act on it now. A lot of what this is more of the introduction of the tools to use with the comprehensive plan. If you would like it included as part of your commission packets, we can discuss that and see if that should be included, and we should incorporate that as part of our policy discussions.
Can I make one more point? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. The other just piece of this is that the tool is like wonderful, but I think it needs to be like anchored in something. And so I was looking through, I think I sent you an email that I was like going down a rabbit hole earlier, and I was looking specifically at like what Seattle has done, where they have like an equity toolkit template that like different projects have gone through. And I'm curious if the city is doing something like that for the comprehensive plan process. So like, what are your equity goals as part of this process that we can then anchor to, right? Because if we don't have like a North Star, it's kind of like we're just doing this to what end, right? And if you can't measure it, you can't move it in a lot of ways. And so I'm just curious if you're going through like a parallel process to kind of set equity goals for.
Yes, so that's one thing that we're trying to examine with the comprehensive plan is how best to establish equity goals and policies for the city, whether it's a new section of goals and policies specific to equity, or if it's more embedded in each of the elements. And a lot of the feedback we received from the equity board is it really should be embedded in a lot of our work, not necessarily called out its own section. And so that's one of the things that we're examining through this work is how best to represent that in the comprehensive plan. But also, Seattle has been using their RSJI tool for decades now, and they didn't get to the point. They started out exactly where we were a couple decades ago and figuring out how best it works for them. It works great now, but where they started, they went through some of the frustrations that were and questions and uncomfortability that we are experiencing now. And so it's absolutely normal to have a lot of those questions and want to do that. But to get to your point, it's important to have that North Star to understand where exactly are we aiming.
Final thing I'm going to say is just to give kudos to the city, right? To like have this conversation, right? To bring this to us, to make this a priority. I think it's like a big step towards accountability, which is really important. And just like acknowledge, right, that this is a journey and it's at the beginning. And I appreciate, you presenting this to us and kind of holding this space. I know that that's not always easy. But the city, just for kind of stepping up and doing this, I want to kind of thank them for bringing this to us.
I also want to thank the commissioners for allowing me to come talk to you. Some of this was at the request of commissioners to have a follow-up discussion, and I want to respect that and make sure that we appreciate these conversations with you and appreciate your understanding of us learning how to have these conversations with you as well. And we, as staff, are also learning how best to use the tools, but also have the conversations with the commission's boards as well as with the community on how best to make improvements and address inequities in the systems.
Any comments, questions? I'll just say, like I said, so far it looks really good. I think the issue that a lot of people have is everyone has a different conception of what equity means to them. So I think it's going to be really helpful as far as moving forward, again, kind of giving the education that you guys are doing. A lot of what I see looks really good. But again, that's probably going to be one of the biggest hurdles is everybody has a very clear definition in their head. It is a little bit of a political hot potato. I think everybody knows that. And then also seeing how the city puts it into practice. Because you have people that argue on one hand, you're lowering standards to the lowest common denominator. And then you also have other people that look and it looks like you're raising people up. So I think the city is going to have to do hopefully a very good job explaining to people what it is that you guys want from us. But I think of like the Issaquah School District. They've done a really good job. I mean, they service kids from Echo Glen's Children's Center all the way up to Harrison Street here in Issaquah. And we are, I believe, number 6 in the state, according to niche.com. So I would say that is one of our most proud institutions we have as a school district. So I think you can look at that, and then you also look at people that, for a lot of people, Seattle is not a point of pride. There are actually a lot of people that are pretty sad about what's happened to Seattle in the last 5 years. So I think it's going to be incumbent on staff to help us understand all of this and what it is you guys are expecting. Because as a young kid, I didn't have some of these things. I wish I would have been around in the early 80s with a lot of opportunities to learn Spanish, my mother's native tongue. They weren't there for me. So I don't know. Some of these things sound really good, but I'm definitely interested to hear more from the city how you guys define this stuff. And I think today's a good start.
Today's definitely a start. And, one of the things of defining what the city wants is really just hearing from a lot of the community members, that being from the boards and commissions, and terms of like, how do we help you understand what we're trying to achieve with a lot of these discussions? But also, who do we need to hear from? Who do we need to go talk to? Who do we need to react? Which relationships do we need to build in order to have some of those conversations that we historically haven't had? Which community groups have not been involved in these discussions? Which groups do we need to talk with who are probably more prominently impacted but have never been recorded in our data? So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to figure out with all of you and we want to address those. And so I would say that's really a major goal with all this, is really to find that direction.
Yeah, and hopefully we can find it together. But I even go back to the example with the manufactured home, because one of the notes I wrote is, so, and again, how does that work when it comes to like retaining neighborhood character? So again, these are all things, again, I think it's a great start, but there's obviously a lot for us to learn and a lot for staff to kind of impart their wisdom and what they're learning. Because again, it means so many different things to so many different people. Commissioner Kraft.
Yes, I just want to, thanks, reiterate one more thing. I do, so I'm showing my history of, I grew up in the tech world. We're super self-critical of everything we do. We beat ourselves up. You always have to have more lowlights and highlights when you present to execs. So I do think there's, and it could be painful, going back to what I mentioned earlier, is looking back at something that happened this last year, putting these lenses and being super critical of what the city should have done differently, thought differently, and utilize that, because I think that would educate. It's much more grounded of an example as we want to roll more of this out to see how we would have done something different. And it just makes it more concrete as opposed to people trying to figure out what does that mean for this thing. And I'm sure there's probably a couple examples, as there always are, that hopefully, oh, if we would have been thinking about this a year ago, maybe we would have asked these different hard questions, or we would have looked at it differently. And I think that should be part of the training. And I think everyone, at least for me, I would say, oh yeah, that reflects back. I'm always critical of all the things that I've done, probably too much so. But I think that would be helpful.
And the only other thing I would say is I would give Issaquah some credit, because one of the biggest disparities we have is socioeconomic, and we've been talking about this for years as far as workforce being able to live and work here. So again, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's a broad topic. I actually like the definition that you guys put in by the city of Renton. I thought that was more helpful than being extremely narrow, because again, it means a lot of different things. And again, for the city of Issaquah, always, I mean, again, some communities are more welcoming than others, but I know we've been having topics as far as the racial, not racial, but the income and economic disparities as long as I've been here. So again, I mean, the city of Issaquah should get some credit for some of that too. Commissioner Altamore.
Are public hearings always in this chamber? Are they always part of these meetings, or do they ever go out on the road?
Yes, public hearings are typically in council chambers.
Yeah.
So if there were a public meeting or something, that could be run by staff and wouldn't necessarily have to follow the commission rules? So if we were trying to bring in different voices who maybe might not feel comfortable coming into this space to gather some of the information in order to really apply this lens, would there be ways to be able to do that? I know the Human Services team went out and did a lot of public meetings as they were getting ready for their Human Services strategic plan. Is there a way for us to also consider something like that that doesn't violate the public meeting rules?
I believe so. I know that the city clerk's office has been looking into different ways of how best to incorporate more voices as part of the discussions while still meeting the state requirements. I know there's limitations around that. So that's something that we are exploring a little.
Any follow-up or other questions or comments for Stephen?
And again, with this slide, it's primarily of, we don't want to stop here. If you have questions, if you'd like to talk with staff more about these discussions or how best to apply the tool or adjust the tool, we'd love to have those discussions with you. For our schedule, we're having our upcoming meetings. We're going to be talking about the land use element, as Kristen was talking about. We're going to be talking about the housing element, as we've been kind of preparing you for the last couple months. And then we're also going to talk about neighborhood planning and have a broad overview of a lot of the other discussions. That concludes my presentation. Are there any other questions?
Well, I think we got you for one more, don't we?
You do.
So now moving on to the third item of regular business is an overview of our June tour. You're gonna hear about all the fun you guys had separately. I know John and myself and Kristen and Thomas had a blast. I think we were the guinea pigs. I think we were the test run. So want to hear a little bit from Stephen about if you guys were able to get what you wanted in terms of showing us around, and then not so much questions tonight because the tours are over. We're not going to probably do them again, but mainly feedback. for Stephen and Kristen about what you thought, maybe things you would have liked to see that you didn't see. But again, really kind of looking just for some feedback, and maybe next time we take a tour. And ultimately anything obviously about housing, a different type of housing. So, Stephen, please.
Thank you, Chair Voice. So as Chair Voice said, tonight's really just going to be an overview of the tours that we went through in June. The intent of this is really just get follow-up information. We had small groups of you to go tour Kirkland, and now as we're together, we're hoping to get a little feedback on what you saw, what things kind of stood out to you, what things should we incorporate as part of our discussions on the policies or updates with the comprehensive plan or even further along. The background in terms of like the purpose of why we organized the tours themselves is because we saw new legislation get adopted this year around middle housing and new housing types, and that being required from a lot of the cities, and that being the bills on the screen of House Bill 1110 now requiring cities to allow middle housing types in single family zones, and then House Bill 1337 is specifically around what we allow for accessory dwelling units, single family zones. And House Bill 1220, which was adopted back in 2021, is the requirement of where we allow emergency shelters and transitional housing in the city, and how we address racial equity within a lot of the demographic and data that we collect, housing as well, and so recognizing that. So we're incorporating a lot of that with this periodic update, and we want to prepare you for that by giving you the real-life applications of this in the city of Kirkland, which you'll find a lot of the different examples of this in other cities, but we found that within a very close proximity in Kirkland, to shorten our tour time, we wanted to show you what Kirkland had, and because they've been actually applying a lot of this for several years. So again, with the tours, the intent was to have you explore regional examples, successes, as well as any types of improvements you could see with the different housing types, the topics we discussed. And then any other environmental factors that you saw during the tour of, it's interesting that this had bus service, but this area didn't. And, is this successful in having those housing types in certain proximity to transit service or any other multimodal services or access to services? So the topics that we addressed or discussed on our tours, we talked about accessory dwelling units and how that's been applied. We talked about cottage housing, courtyard housing, looked at duplexes and triplex, how that's been incorporated in different neighborhoods. We also talked about micro housing and its location within central Issaquah and the proximity to different amenities and services, and the importance of that in terms of like what is offered as a micro unit as well as what's offered in proximity of where micro unit. We also looked at emergency shelters and transitional housing, the one example in Kirkland, but also talked about different examples on some of our tours. And again, we all talked about the infrastructure that was supporting a lot of these different hubs, how Kirkland has put together their downtown relations. So for tonight, we're looking for feedback. What did you see? What did you like? What didn't you like? What would you like to see more of potentially, as Chair Boy said? Maybe we go on further tours as we're having some of these policy discussions, just so we can better understand something that we didn't explore.
Commissioner Krass, my travel buddy.
It was fun.
Please.
I mean, it's first of all, Kirkland's beautiful for those of you who live there.
Yes,
There's a couple things. The threads of transit is key to a couple. The emergency shelters, I'm not as familiar with. We spent a little time there, and personally, I don't know enough about that to understand, except for transit, I assume is very important. The micro housing, micro units, I just think, yes, maybe when we have a transit center and a train and lots, then it would be great. But I think it's hard to see that fitting into Issaquah for a very long period of time, unless other things change. But that one's so dependent on transit as well as the full infrastructure of everything you need without having to have a car. The one thing that has intrigued me, and I only see a little bit here and there, we didn't get a huge amount around the ADUs, because those could be done with people who already have houses and adding another unit into, especially if they have a large enough lot to be able to put another unit in, especially if we reduce parking requirements and all of it. We didn't see a ton of that. We saw one, I think, in Kirkland where they were called ADUs, but I think they sold them all individually, which then just becomes condos. But I'm curious if others looked a little bit more about ADUs, because in terms of how can things happen in the shorter term, it seems like those could happen quicker than building new apartment complexes and all of that, which may take, decades. So any other questions about, ADUs? Because we only got a little glimpse of that, and it's a little different than when I think of an ADU, which is, I have another unit, I can rent it to a teacher who lives in this market, or a fireman who doesn't have to travel as far, fire person, etc.
I'm trying to think, our car, I don't know about all your guys' cars, but our car had a robust discussion on the ADUs, and also a little bit, I think Stephen, Sarah, and I were talking a little bit about the micro housing. Those were the two that caught my eye. I thought what Commissioner Kraft was mentioning, kind of how they were subletting it and basically turning it into more housing speculation and really not doing with the intention. So we thought that was kind of funny. And then I think Stephen and I were kind of talking, and Stephen had mentioned that the micro housing, there's potential for it. I mean, I didn't really see it. I think you and I were discussing it. And to your point, yeah, the transportation would be a key part of that. But yeah, no, I found it all very, very fast. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Commissioner Patterson.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely appreciated the opportunity to go out there. Seeing it on paper and screen versus the real life application, I think was a huge difference. It really helped hit things home. I was particularly taken in by the cottage housing option that we looked at. So I think there was like 10 units on 2 lots, which across the street, then there was 2 houses on 2 lots. And to see that like parallel to each other was kind of mind blowing. But with the caveat being, the cottage housing was a very yeah, it was cool. It looked cool. It looked beautiful. The courtyard. Yeah, I heard your group might take a little closer look than our group did, but
Got chased out.
but yeah, I thought that with the courtyard, and you could even see the neighbors connecting in the courtyard area. It just looked like it had kind of this good vibe about it that I really enjoyed. And the housing, on paper and everything looked really small. I was expecting a summer camp expectation going into it. But I mean, the houses are great sized. I mean, I live in a condo and it was much bigger than that. So I think it just opened my eyes to this would be, in my opinion, a great addition to a community. On that note, the ADU we looked at was very perplexing. We looked at one where there were 3, the main primary residence and then 2 ADUs, one connected by a garage, and then one about 6 foot behind the other one, which was just bizarre, especially considering they all shared a driveway and they were all sold separately, as you mentioned. So very interesting setup. I think, I can't imagine that being always a successful option, though I do support the ADU approach and think it's a viable option with some different arrangements than what we viewed.
I'm sure it was successful for the homeowner.
Yeah, I'm sure they made a good chunk on that. The other thing I wanted to call out was when we did look at the micro units, the one thing that stuck out to me is that for some reason when we first talked about it, I imagined one building full of micro units, very, but in reality it's a mixed use where you have say 80 apartments and 20 micro units or something along those lines with some affordable housing mixed in. I think when I think of diversity of housing, I think that really helps hit that home. You're giving a lot of different options to different types of people with different lifestyles. And in this case, that whole downtown Kirkland area is so interconnected with the transit and the walkability of the paths through the park area. I agree with John. It was a beautiful growth that I've seen even in the last few years, 5 years, though I know it's been 20-ish since they've kind of went down this journey. So, but overall, great trip and learned a lot on it.
That's great. Thank you, Commissioner Patterson. That's fantastic feedback. Round robin, Commissioner Kennedy, Commissioner Altamore, Vice Chair Bader. Anything you guys would like to add as far as the tour? Commissioner Kennedy.
I just thought it was really helpful. I mean, I know I'm a visual learner, and being able to go and see them physically and talk about the different characteristics. I mean, even we talked about some of those apartment complexes, and when you talk about sort of how they're stepped, because you can describe things when we're in here, and we can see photos, but then looking, I'm like, oh, now I get it. It's just seeing it in the flesh just makes it that much better. So I enjoyed it.
Commissioner Altamore.
That was the piece that stood out the most to me, and I guess because we were on the same tour, but the setback discussion and the architectural design of how that affects the look and feel of the neighborhood. I thought that was a really important discussion that we had. And we were comparing and contrasting some other cities that we've all experienced, and just the different feel of that monolith right next to the sidewalk versus some really well done setbacks, et cetera, and those architectural pieces. So something I'd love for us to keep in mind as we go through this too.
I did a virtual Google Maps and was impressed by Steven's ability to zoom around Google Maps tour the other day, which was maybe not as meaningful as being there in person, but I was still impressed. And I guess what I left with was one that I thought that I can't remember what it was called, but that development, kind of like more urban development in Kirkland, where I think the micro units were, that was cool. And I was like, if that's the vision for like central Issaquah, I think that's exciting. And so I was like, yay to that. And then also that I could see like a place for all of those different housing types, right? Especially like knowing that it's not tomorrow, but over time. And so I think it's great to have the option to build any and all of the different types of housing that you showed.
All right, and I just want to say, oh, go ahead, Commissioner Altamore.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just had a follow-up question. As we were talking about these different housing types, I'm just wondering, because all of these East Side cities are also going through their comp plan amendment discussions, is King County Metro or Sound Transit engaging in this at all in terms of understanding what the transit hopes are of the different communities, because we're also interconnected?
Yes, so through a lot of the regional groups with PSRC in King County, Metro and Sound Transit are engaged with a lot of this. And vice versa. A lot of cities and city staff are engaged with County Metro and making them aware of what our visions are of, our central Issaquah is really going to be needing a high service for transit, and how do we incorporate that before 2044 when light rail gets here, and how do we support the systems to get it here? And so yes, they're engaged with the cities and our staff in particular of how best to do that within their systems. At the same time, they're also trying to figure out how to recover from a pandemic that is almost decimated a lot of their ridership, and that a lot of that is now coming back, but they're still trying to figure out how to adjust from that. So some of the discussions have changed since pre-pandemic, and trying to figure out how best to move forward on a lot of that is a little bit different.
All right, and I just wanted to say thank you to staff. That was incredible. Really appreciate Kristen and Stephen taking time out of their day to show us around, in particular Kristen, because that was our chauffeur, John and I's chauffeur, and obviously Thomas, who I imagine right now is probably in Europe, right? Oh, is he already back? Okay, well, I guess that was a month. But regardless, thank you both very much, and to all of our city staff who helped put that together. I agree with fellow commissioners. I thought it was very educational. It was very nice to be able to see that in person, have top-notch explanations from our staff. So well done. Yeah, and to your point, yes, I could see a lot of that housing here. I mean, I still have some questions about how it would be done, but that was very, very helpful. The cottage ones were great. They did a really good job. I mean, I hope you like your neighbor, but otherwise, yeah, it was great. So, All right, well, thank you, Stephen. That's going to take care of our regular business tonight, but we do have a little bit more time remaining for reports. Does staff, Kristen, Stephen, do you have anything to share as far as our city council update?
Since our last meeting, City Council adopted the new housing definitions into the code of what was previously discussed with all of you, that being incorporating courtyard, cottage, and 3 units? What were the 3 that were added? Was it micro unit? Thank you. So we'll send you a link to all that new code language, but more work will be coming. Like, what does that mean now?
Okay, great, thank you. I think that's it for staff updates. That's it. Commissioners, any other business announcements? Anything good for the order? All right, looks like our next meeting is set for July 27th. We can officially adjourn this meeting. Yeah, perfect timing. It is currently 7:55 p.m. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everybody.